Welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Criterion, your regular channel exclusively previewing new and forthcoming titles in the Criterion collection. This time we'll be taking a look at two British films, that's How to Get Ahead in Advertising and Withnail and I, both coming to collection in Blu-ray and 4K UHD. Handmade Films was a British production company formed in the late 1970s by ex-Beatle George Harrison. The company was responsible for contributing a number of films for distribution in UK cinemas through the late 70s right into the 1980s. Now, one of the films they made was a film that became a 1987 cult masterpiece starring Paul McGann and Richard E. Grant. It's hailed the crown jewel of cinematic dissolution, and it's an existentially hilarious and deeply tragic portrait of two out-of-work actors swirling down the drain of 1969 London. And it's directed by Bruce Robinson and based on his own life in the late 1960s. In Withnail and I, we see two unemployed young actors bumming around and sharing a flat in Camden Town. Needing a holiday, they obtain the key to a cottage in the Lake District belonging to Withnail's eccentric Uncle Monty and drive out there. But the weekend proves more stressful and less relaxing for this pair of ne'er-do-wells than they had first anticipated. The screenplay is an adaptation of an unpublished novel written by its director, Bruce Robinson. Actor friend Don Hawkins passed a copy of the manuscript to his friend Mordecai Schreiber in 1980. He paid Robinson £20,000 to adapt it into a screenplay. Robinson met him in LA, voicing his concern that he might not be able to continue because the writing broke basic screenplay rules and it was hard to make it work as a film. Because it also used colloquial English, it was felt as well many international viewers, including those in the USA, would struggle to understand the dialogue. The script was completed nonetheless, and producer Paul Heller urged Robinson to direct it, and he found half of the funding. The script then went to Handmade Films in London, and George Harrison agreed to finance the remainder of the project. And Bruce Robinson was soon shooting at various locations, including in Cumbria, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire and London Shepperton Studios. Withnail and I is set in London in the 1960s, and our two out-of-work actors are desperate for a change of scenery. Out of money and, more importantly, out of booze, Withnail and Marwood, that's Richard E. Grant and Paul McGann, talk Withnail's rich Uncle Monty, Richard Griffiths, into letting them have the keys to his countryside cottage, and there the adventure begins. Now, as you might imagine, these two thespians set off to the country totally unprepared, bringing no provisions at all except for booze, that Withnail promptly demolished on their trip out there. Arriving in a blinding rainstorm and driving a Jaguar with one headlight and one windshield wiper, their woes begin almost immediately. They're desperate for wood, food and other common necessaries, and this hapless duo appeals to the local townspeople for help, but they encounter downright hostility coming from some very strange characters, including Jake the Poacher, played by British stalwart Michael Elphick, and things look hopelessly bleak until Monty shows up unexpectedly in the middle of the night, scaring the hell out of them, as they were expecting an unfriendly visit instead from Jake the Poacher. Now, Monty, of course, being highly organised and efficient, brings food, booze and other supplies and is looking forward to a nice weekend with his boys. And note the inference there. Monty is also a raving homosexual, and his designs on Marwood especially, with encouragement from the scheming Withnail. Now, after yet another run-in with the townspeople, this time at a stuffy tea house, Monty and the boys retire to the country house for food, drink and lots of inane prattle, all of it totally hilarious. Now, I don't want to spoil anything more in the plot, but the rest of the movie involves Monty's not-so-subtle attempts to seduce Marwood, and Marwood's attempts to politely avoid these advances. Withnail, ever the drunk, does not help matters at all here, and the blow-up between the two friends is absolutely comical. Now, the acting and wordsmithing in Withnail and I is just stunning. The British dry humour throughout the film has seldom been better, and this is only Richard E. Grant's second film. But clearly, it's a masterpiece. What is so amazing is that Grant portrays a drunk, and Grant is a teetotal. He never broke character. This is a film that requires multiple viewings to appreciate it, but it's well worth it. The film's a comedy, but there's a sort of tragic sadness to it. Ultimately, the movie is an eulogy to what was said to be the greatest decade ever. That's the 1960s. Now, Withnail and I, though, is much more than just a mere comedy with snappy lines. It's a film with a huge cult following as well, and it's infinitely quotable. It's also a film about coming of age and friendship. And it's a bizarre and lopsided friendship as well, that readily exposes Withnail as one who throws Marwood under the bus several times, in fact, at the pub, to the Randy Bull, to Jake the Poacher, and to his Uncle Monty. And to understand this relationship is to understand and appreciate the very essence of this masterpiece itself, Withnail and Marwood, and Withnail and I, and love it to a fault. Now, the laughs come from the fruity language in the film. I've only had a few ales. I mean to have you, even if it must be by burglary. And then the beep beep will rule the day, and so on. The humanity, it's set in another decade, but it could be set any time. And of course, the unrelenting squalor throughout. Little wonder it strikes so many chords with those in higher education. George Harrison and handmaid partner Dennis O'Brien saw rushes when the crew was shooting on location in the Lake District, and apparently found the chicken scene as funny as cancer, and wanted Uncle Monty, that's Richard Griffiths, to be more of a camp caricature to ensure easy laughs. And to Robinson's credit, he stood his ground, and to theirs, they eventually left him to it. Now, it is self-belief that saw the unlikely project come to fruition. His writing that made Grant's Withnail, Griffiths' Uncle Monty, and Ralph Brown's befuddled Danny the Dealer such memorable screen creations. Which, that's not to detract from the performances, of course. These are actors who really get the gags, just to say that Withnail and I's genius flows from the written page. It's Robinson's mastery of tone that makes Withnail endure, that rich, sweet sadness that permeates every frame as the 60s draw to a close and the dream begins to fade, and as Uncle Monty and Withnail struggle desperately to escape the shadow of loneliness and failure, and the unnamed I passes his audition and abandons them both to their fate. It wasn't a trick that Bruce Robinson could repeat, but then neither could anyone else. Now, Criterion aren't the first to bring this comic 80s masterpiece to 4K, as Arrow released it on 4K UHD some months back. Now, this 4K UHD Blu-ray perfectly preserves the film's sickly beauty. It's not awash with colour, but then its colour palette wasn't designed with that in mind. But the detail shines through of the squalor of 60s urban Britain, and the filth of the countryside are also vivid. The dark lighting in evidence in the cinematography by celebrated lighting cameraman Peter Hannon, and we can also see no crushing artefacts. It's got a mono soundtrack, which serves the film well, both with the dialogue, and then we have David Dundas and Rick Wentworth's romantic score, and the occasional smattering of 60s psychedelic music. And if you recognise David Dundas, he made a brief appearance in the UK music charts in 1977 with his song Jeans On from the television commercial. Now, there are 2 audio commentaries and a 1999 making of documentary, as well as a photo gallery. The release comes as a 4K Blu-ray combo with the following supplemental features. There's the 4K digital restoration, supervised by director of photography Peter Hannon, with uncompressed mono soundtrack. One 4K UHD disc of the film presented in Dolby Vision HDR, and one Blu-ray with the film and these features. 2 audio commentaries, one from 2020 featuring director Bruce Robinson, and the other from 2001 featuring actors Ralph Brown and Paul McGann. new short programme featuring Robinson and actor Richard E. Grant. Withnail and Us, 1999, a documentary on the making of the film itself. British Film Institute Q&A from 2017 with Robinson and Grant. It's celebrating the film's 20th anniversary. Stills Gallery featuring photographs by artist Ralph Steadman. Trailer and an essay written by the critic David Kearns. And the illustration is by Ralph Steadman. Withnail and I gets an upgrade onto 4K in the collection and has a running time of 107 minutes and comes in a 185:1 aspect ratio, and it releases on Tuesday the 20th of May in the US only as existing spine 119. 2 years after this, Bruce Robinson reunited with Richard E. Grant again in How to Get Ahead in Advertising, a black comedy fantasy film which was written and directed by Robinson and starred Grant and Rachel Ward. An advertising executive has a nervous breakdown and finds himself concerned with the ethics of his profession. Now, as a result, a surreal occurrence takes place, and this manifestation represents the cynical and unscrupulous side of his personality. Now, in the film's opening scene, Bagley, that's the character Richard E. Grant plays, presides over a meeting where he exalts a closed ecosystem of advertising, bragging through a dagger smile that they can sell junk food to the masses and advance body image standards to guilt those same consumers into buying fad diet products. Bagley sees everyone as lemmings, whose hypocrisies are made to be exploited, and to the point that he even ruins dinner parties with friends, taunting them with how easy it is to manipulate their subliminal desires to buy. Now, it's a common fact that a film's script is only as good as the actors performing the script. And How to Get Ahead in Advertising has a remarkably funny script. But let me be perfectly frank here. Almost all of that was due to Richard E. Grant's mind-blowing performance in the film. It is a performance for the ages. He truly acts every ounce out of this film. He shows incredible range that many other actors would struggle with. His manic energy, his wide-eyed nervousness, his sly sarcasm, and his inane ability to go absolutely crazy to create an unforgettable performance. Both his opening and ending monologues in the film are spine-chillingly good. On its own, the first act of How to Get Ahead in Advertising would be spectacular, a simple attack against the advertising industry. It was funny, poignant and unique. It didn't need to get weird, but it almost certainly did, and that just made it even more brilliant. How many filmmakers will take the risk of having a talking boil grow on the neck of our protagonist and still keep the film brilliant? Well, to be perfectly honest, How to Get Ahead in Advertising is understandably divisive. It isn't a film for everyone. If someone complains that this film is juvenile or disturbing, well, they wouldn't be wrong. However, there is absolutely nothing wrong with a film being juvenile as long as the childishness is contained and controlled. And there are some scenes that could reproduce laughter or indeed nausea in the viewer. I'm lucky enough to belong to the former category, although those in the latter have every right to be apprehensive. Now, that's not to say this is a bad or even a mediocre film. It's a divisive masterpiece, as I say, just like a great film should be, because when the common consensus is that a film is praised almost universally, intense hatred will arise out of those who feel it even slightly overrated. Why doesn't How to Get Ahead in Advertising show up on more lists of great films then? Well, that's a question I'm not quite sure of the answer to. Surely it should. It was a unique and very funny film. I think it's too offbeat and strange to be fully appreciated when it came out. But I now think there's a small but growing cult base for this film. And I think a resurgence of this film, catapulting it into cult popularity, is certainly due. And I will do every part to get this film more fans. It's one of the great lesser-seen British comedies of all time. And it's also one of the smartest comedies I've ever come across. If David Cronenberg made a Monty Python film, it would be this: hilarious, disturbing and absolute fun. If not only for the beautifully profound monologue, but Grant delivers it with supreme acting abilities. Grant's physicality is also magnetic in the film, arguably faltering and manifesting Bagley's psychic break by the emergence of a sentient boil on his shoulder that becomes the embodiment of his earlier greed, which can't be fully eradicated by the man's sudden change of heart. Deriding the new moral Bagley as a communist, the Boyle attempts to assert control over Bagley's body, which it eventually succeeds in doing, and now confined to the Boyle, Bagley's softer side can only bear witness to his worse, half-acting without restraint. Nonetheless, the go-for-broke intensity of Grant's performance remains magnetic. It's one of the few pieces of acting by someone other than Nicolas Cage that approaches that actor's best work, of throwing oneself into absurdism so fully that one emerges less a clown than a pure reflection of all the contradictions and hypocrisies that make up an individual. If Robinson's script spreads itself too thin, Grant embodies the true insanity of trying to perceive just how vast the broken and manipulated system that shapes us really is. It's maybe perhaps the innate humour in the film that actually stopped it progressing, and indeed crossing over to the US, where it didn't play well. It wasn't even theatrically successful in the UK, playing in the Odeons up and down the country, where it was replaced in their programme fairly quickly at the time, I remember. Now, the supporting cast is made up from quite a few famous British performers, and that includes Rachel Ward as Julia Bagley, Richard Wilson as John Bristol, Tony Slattery as Basil, Pauline Melville as Mrs. Wallace, Sean Bean as Larry Frisch, and Bruce Robinson himself as the voice of the Boyle. American actor Jim Carrey called Richard E. Grant genius for his performance in this film, and once again the production company was Handmade Films. It only took a modest $355,000 at the US box office. Criterion are now upgrading the film from the previous DVD in the collection to a Blu-ray, and the Blu-ray has the film and these supplemental features. 2K digital restoration supervised by director of photography Peter Hannon, with 2.0 surround DTS HD master audio soundtrack. Documentary featuring interviews with writer-director Bruce Robinson and actor Richard E. Grant. There's a trailer and an essay written by the critic David Kearns. And the new illustration is by Jackson Norton. With a running time of 94 minutes and an aspect ratio of 185:1, this film is a tour de force of verbal jousting and physical comedy, and it's also a caustic Jekyll and Hyde tale for the greed of the 1980s. It comes to the Criterion Collection on Blu-ray only, in the US only, from Tuesday the 20th of May, as existing spine 120. Next time on Let's Talk Criterion, we'll be taking a look at two films directed by Richard Lester, and that's The Three and The Four Musketeers, both coming to the collection as a set on 4K UHD. So until then, from me, it's goodbye, and above all, good Criterion viewing.